Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the online discussion on Beyond Rana Plaza, Building a Sustainable Future for Garment Workers in India and the World. This dialogue is part of Fashion Revolution Week from 22nd to 29th April. We all know that the tragic collapse of Rana Plaza factory in Bangladesh shed a light on dangerous working conditions and exploitation of workers in the global fashion industry. Since then, I know efforts have been made to improve the working conditions and promote sustainability in the industry. This discussion, we will explore with our esteemed panelists the challenges faced by garment workers in India as well as the rest of the world, and the steps being taken to create a more sustainable and equitable future. I would like to welcome Petra Brannmark, Communications Director from IndustriALL, an international organization that represents more than 50 million workers in 140 countries in mining, energy, and manufacturing, including the garment and textile, leather, and shoe sectors. It is a force in global solidarity, taking up the fight for better working conditions and trade unions' rights around the world. We have Suhasini Singh, the country manager for India at FairWear Foundation, where she has worked since 2013. She's also the regional coordinator for South Asia, and she was previously program director at CVDEP. Her work focuses on labor rights in the fashion industry, in the garment industry, particularly for women workers, and she has authored several articles and research reports on the topic. Delphine Williot is Policy and Campaigns Manager at Fashion Revolution, where she focuses on promoting accountability at all levels of fashion supply chain. With a background in environmental policy, Delphine is passionate about transforming the fashion industry into a fairer, more equitable, and environmentally conscious sector. Her work includes Fashion Transparency Index and Good Clothes Fair Pay campaign. Abhishek Jani is the CEO of Fairtrade India project with more than 2 decades of experience working with startups, social enterprises, multinationals in India and abroad. He has held various leadership and advisory positions in marketing, food and beverage, and technology ventures. Abhishek received his bachelor's in economics from St. Stephen's College, Delhi University, and his master's in economics from the University of Cambridge. At Fairtrade India, he leads the team that focuses on building a sustainable and ethical platform for consumers, institutions, businesses, and farmer organizations in India, with the aim of spreading awareness about sustainability, UN SDGs, and fair trade. This dialogue will be moderated by Suki Dosanjh Lenz. She's the founder of Fashion Revolution India, and by me, Shruti Singh. I'm the country head for Fashion Revolution India. Suki, I would like to invite you to please set the context for today's dialogue and share why this dialogue is particularly important now and what is beyond Rana Plaza.
Thank you so much, Shruti, and thank you all for joining today's session. The mission of today's session is to really think about where we are now, 10 years on from Rana Plaza, not to remember why we're all here today, but also to see how we are all building a more sustainable future for garment workers in India and around the world. So the purpose of this session is to engage with one another, to find out more, and to see how we can do something going forward. So I'm delighted to have us all together. And secondly, I don't want to lose any time because we've got a ton of questions that came in from some of our network already. So I would say let's dive straight into the first question, Shruti.
This question is open for all. Can you share some of the most significant changes that have taken place in the garment industry since Rana Plaza tragedy in 2013? What have we accomplished in region across the domains of worker rights, consumer education, and activating brands and designers? So any change that you have noticed, any good thing, policies that have come up and have significantly improved the grassroots reality of garment workers? Who wants to take this one?
I'll be happy to take that. To start, I'm sure everyone has something to contribute. Obviously, I would say that the Bangladesh Accord is one of the groundbreaking change factors for textile and garment industry in Bangladesh in terms of worker safety. I mean, it came off the tragic collapse of Rana Plaza, but unions managed to and brands as well, and the Bangladeshi government managed to, out of the rubble, turn this into a legally binding agreement, which has achieved enormous change. I can't give you the numbers straight off, but they're there. I mean, there, you know, there's been thousands of inspections made. There have been fire safety mechanisms installed, everything from sprinkler to fire extinguishers to fire doors, all of that. But what it also has given is it has given workers a means to what's it called, a recourse, so that they have the right to, under the Accord factories, they have the right to refuse unsafe work. And there have been instances of through the Accord, workers have been able to say that this factory is not deemed safe. They filed a complaint and they have the right to refuse unsafe work, which is a game changer, and you know, which is, and up until Rana Plaza, which is what the you know, the unsafe working environments was part of what the garment industry was built on.
And I think on the back of what you just said, Petra, I think what's important for everyone to remember that on the build-up to the Rana Plaza disaster, on the build-up to 24th of April 2013, people that worked in that factory were complaining for some time about the cracks that were appearing and safety. They weren't heard. Their voices were not heard. They weren't listened to. In fact, they walked in on that day to work with fear at the forefront. They were afraid of not getting paid or losing their jobs. So they showed up, and at what cost? You know, over 1,000 people died because they showed up to work. They didn't want to be there. Thousands were injured. So if anybody else has anything that they'd like to offer, I mean, there's people that turn up to work in unsafe conditions still today.
Yeah, if I can add to what Petra said, and Suki, I mean, the Accord was a groundbreaking agreement, and even till this date, I mean, a decade down the line, we are looking up to Accord, and also the fact that they are starting in new countries like Pakistan, where it is much required. It is such a commendable step of Accord. But I think what also merits a mention is the government of Bangladesh, for example, and the textile industry overall did acknowledge that things were wrong, you know, and the fact that, and such an agreement, a binding agreement of international character, will have a role or should be there to address it. So the acknowledgement of things not being good in itself is the first step to, you know, making things better. So, and then you see how it can be done better. And then I think it parallelly, there were also, if you look at the larger canvas, there were GFA, several global framework agreements that were signed with IndustriALL and the global brands. I mean, the effectiveness, we still have to see. Accord is much more effective. But I mean, I'm just saying what all went, you know, after Rana Plaza, which was, I mean, and in all positive steps. The grievance mechanism under Accord and several other platforms that allowed workers to complain, make a complaint and say, I am aggrieved and I don't, I mean, in some way, I mean, it can be a physical harm or just stress or sexual harassment. It could be, the range of grievance can be wider, but that also, the existence of a platform where they can file a complaint and the complaints are at rest. That is also a positive change that we see in the last 10 years. And then, of course, we see a lot of discussion among all the stakeholders of the industry, among brands or suppliers or workers and workers' rights organizations like us, on accountability, transparency, sustainability. So these are also, I mean, it's much more deeper, intense, and well meant. So it's not just for greenwashing, but there are actions following the, you know, discussions and dialogues. So I see these, you know, several things going parallelly in all positive direction after Rana Plaza, which was such a, it's not a nice thing to have triggered these actions. It was such, I mean, it's a very tragic event, but the actions are all positive after that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, go on. Abhishek, Delphine.
To add to this as well, I think what Rana Plaza really showed is the lack of accountability from international and global brands. And I think what's really positive is that we've never seen so many EU legislations in the pipeline trying to regulate the fashion industry. And this is a huge shift that 10 years ago would definitely not have been possible. Of course, there's issues in terms of the legislation that's currently being discussed, and nothing is ultimately perfect. We've seen the vote on the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive a few days ago by the jury committee, which looks again at ensuring that brands are held accountable on their human rights and environmental impacts across their supply chain. And obviously that does include health and safety. Of course, there's discussions around grievance mechanisms, but this is a huge step for the fashion industry, as this is the first time the EU is actually trying to regulate the industry as a whole. So that's the first thing, the first positive move that we can flag. The second is from a fashion revolution perspective. Following the Rana Plaza collapse, we know that people were looking through the rubbles to find labels and understand which brands were actually producing in that factory. And most of the times, the brands themselves did not even know that they were producing that factory. And this is why we created the Fashion Transparency Index, which is our annual report, which reviews and ranks 250 of the world's largest brands and retailers based on their public disclosure on human rights and environmental impacts, policies and practices. And we've really seen a shift in terms of how far we've come from, in terms of transparency. Of course, we're not where we need to be, but this is definitely something that 10 years ago was just not even part of the conversation, whereas now transparency, I think, is becoming a lot more mainstream.
Abhishek, did you want to step in? I know you had something to say.
Well, no, similar to Delphine, I think if you take I wanted to build on what actually Suhasini said, and just also what Delphine has added, that if you take a step back and understand about the broader sustainability, importance to the concept of sustainability and what is happening in the production systems 10 years ago to where it is today, I would say across a spectrum of stakeholders, there is a lot higher consciousness and much more positive dialogue happening, right? So I would say one of the great changes is the fashion revolution itself, right? The fact that so many consumers are now even understanding that they need to think about the people behind the label, what that fashion is one of the most polluting industries, and how they could be contributing to that. You know, I think that itself is a consciousness that's kind of moved. I'm not saying we are there yet, but it's a huge journey and a great step in that direction. As Delphine also said, I wanted to flag the fact that a number of legislations that a number of countries have picked up. The EU is taking a lead through the HREDD. Before that, the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, in Australia, even in some states in the US. In India, as well. We've got the BRSR, the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Reporting, which is going to become mandatory for the top listed stock exchange companies on the Bombay Stock Exchange. So, you know, whether it's in the developing world context, whether it's in Europe and America, you're seeing dialogues moving across. And I think all of this has got brands also woken up about it, right? They've realized that they cannot say that, sorry, we didn't know, and that's going to be acceptable. They cannot say, I mean, the legislation now is going to actually demand that they know. So it's going to bring that whole responsibility right onto them. And that it's in their interest, actually, that they go deeper into understanding and hopefully taking action. So I think the agency across different stakeholders has awakened. Unfortunately, it took this tragedy for a lot of that to happen. And I'm really hoping that, you know, we continue to make progress in that multi-stakeholder and a systematic way that we're starting off now.
And can I just jump in really quickly as well, just to also come off the back, whatever, I mean, we all agree with each other. And I also think that you point to something really important, this emerging legislation. And both Germany and France have adopted due diligence laws that hold their companies responsible. The one in Germany has, you know, it's just yet to be tested because it came into force in January this year. But it basically means that if you employ more than if you employ more than 3,000 people globally in your company, you are responsible for your entire supply chain. And that, of course, is going to have a huge shift because although consumer awareness is really good and that can drive change, it's an unreasonable request to put on the average consumer to be able to, you know, digest information from a piece of clothing, whether it's ethically sourced or made. And I remember having a conversation with a member of my family who said, well, but it's really, the Accord has made it clearer because now I can buy clothes made in Bangladesh. And it's like, yes, you can, and you should buy clothes, and it's up to the brands to sort their supply chains, but it's actually only the Accord covered factories. So I think that all framework that can be around, and of course, this is pushed by consumer awareness. So consumer awareness is important. I just think that we have to be careful as well not to put too much pressure. It's not down to because it is, at the end of the day, it's down to the brands. And so we need to have mechanisms in place that make them realize it's in their best interest to make sure that their supply chains are squeaky clean, if nothing else.
And I have a question, and maybe I think a few of you could probably answer it, but maybe this is for Suhasini or Petra. But what has this week, especially Fashion Revolution Week, we've seen people protesting, going into certain stores and asking them to sign the Accord. What has a brand got to lose by signing the Accord? What would stop them from wanting to sign the Accord? Is there an answer to that for anyone that's perhaps curious to know?
They don't, I can say, they don't, of course, they have nothing to lose from the Accord. I'm thinking as a speaker. So of course they have nothing to lose by signing the Accord. I know that some brands who haven't signed the Accord so far and who have been courted, been asked to sign the Accord, they use arguments like, oh, but we have such good measures in place, so we don't need it. I really struggle to think that's true, obviously, because at the end of the day, it's not a binding mechanism. And at the end of the day, you need legally binding mechanisms. You need mandatory due diligence. But that's an argument that's used. And you can also say, apart from the fact that you need legal binding mechanisms, that's the only way to be able to, at the end of the day, refuse unsafe work or, file grievances. What these brands who are not signing the Accord, some of them are sourcing from Accord factories. So they're also free riding or freeloading in a way of other brands who have signed up to the Accord, who have, taken the responsibility and made the financial commitment. And you have brands, because of how the supply chain looks in Bangladesh, so you have brands who publicly say, we're not going to sign the Accord, and they are de facto producing in Accord factories.
Yeah. Can I add? As Petra said, there's nothing to lose. In fact, they lose if they don't sign on the Accord. At least for all FairWear member brands, that is how it is. Because we keep, for all brands sourcing from Bangladesh, it's like from FairWear, it's like you have to sign the Accord. And if you're not a signatory, then you have to source from at least where other signatory members are sourcing from. But if you do that, you do not get access to all the information that an Accord signatory gets, like the list of factories or the number of the complaints and those kind of things. So it's actually, they lose if they don't sign. One factor that can be, and again, I'm talking from FairWear because most of our brands are mid to small size brands from Europe. Cost is slight deterrent, especially if they are not, the sourcing from Bangladesh is not big. So if it has to be, the sourcing has to matter because then it's an investment to sign the Accord. But I would not say that is the determinant to not sign the Accord. And similarly, now with Pakistan, we are saying you should, if you're sourcing from Pakistan, you should sign the Accord. Because now Accord is in Pakistan as well. So it's the other way, that if they don't sign Accord, then they lose, and not, they lose if,
I want to just bring in a different context because, a big chunk of my time is trying to convince brands to source more sustainably. And I sense that the hesitation here is similar to the kind of hesitation we see often with Fairtrade, which is a multi-stakeholder platform, right? Is that the brands feel that they lose control on certain sourcing parameters, right? So one of the big reasons why, with Fairtrade, we've constantly faced challenge is because we tell the brands that you need to now start undertaking practices, particularly which affect some of your commercials, like your price and paying an extra price to the farmer, which you will not directly control. You have to pay it if you sign up to this. And then once you do sign up to this, of course, then you're on that trajectory where then if there is a continuous improvement program, people feel that, that they are going out of that. that is it. But I think if you look at it in the context of responsible business, if you look at it in the context of where legislation is going, if you look at it in the context that there's a Harvard case study that Unilever has got where they say actually the most responsible and sustainable brands are most profitable, right? So whichever way you want to look at it, it is the right trajectory for brands to go on. It's just that on a short-term basis, if you sign up to these things, then you are making commitments which are more wider implications and longer lasting. Like, for instance, if there is a pandemic, you must honor your commitments, right? Things like that, which haven't happened, brands suddenly feel that they're going to be scrutinized on that through a different lens. So I think that's the only negative things that I have heard in the context of brands, and they will never admit it publicly, frankly speaking. It's just the subtext that you will read. But actually, it is the right trajectory for them to take. It's the ethical trajectory for them to take. And in the long run, it does pay off.
And what I know, it's a great thing that Pakistan is also having an accord. What is the India equivalent or the closest to? Do we have something similar, a similar kind of protection for workers, similar kind of accountability mechanisms, if any? I would love for you to chime in and share on that front.
I'm going to go first before you, Suhasini, but because you mentioned the GFAs. So the accord is in Bangladesh and it has been extended to Pakistan. And so it will cover factories in Pakistan. And there are talks to extending it further. I think the primarily talks are around Middle East, Northern Africa region. Because ideally this would be something that could be rolled out in all garment producing countries. So what the recourse, again, it comes back to, from our perspective as well. So you mentioned earlier that there are a number of global framework agreements. So IndustriALL has signed a number of global framework agreements with garment producing companies. So we have one with H&M, one with Inditex, Chibo, Mizuno, and one more I can't remember. But we have in all our industries, but these are the particular ones for the garment industry. So what they represent is like a global, it's like a global collective agreement. And so the brand, by this agreement, physically signing it, as we speak, they commit to, uphold, to respect workers' rights, to allow freedom of association, collective bargaining, basically all rights that they would allow in their often, most cases, European home country, where it's sort of, there's a long tradition of industry bargaining or, social dialogue. And so under the GFA, national unions can take recourse through the GFA if there's a complaint, if there's been layoffs, or if there's collective bargaining is not advancing. It's up to the local and national union to try to resolve the issue firsthand. But if they can't, then they can make recourse to IndustriALL, and then we have the direct relationship with H&M, who will often actually have the direct relationship then with the union in question. But so there is that. That is, so the global framework agreements do work as, sort of institutionalized safeguard for workers' rights. However, they are not legally binding.
Yeah.
There is no, So that's, and I think that's, I'm going to say it again and then I'm going to stop saying it, but I think that's the major difference that it comes down to at the end of the day. So they are really good. And we have, we as IndustriALL, we have very good working relationship with both Inditex and H&M. I think H&M was the first one to sign the Bangladesh Accord. So they actually work. But we also have cases of global framework agreements in other sectors that, that don't actually work because there's no will to engage.
And to answer your question, Shruti, on if there is a equivalent platform or agreement in India, so if we just talk about the health and safety, the structural health and the structural safety of the workplace in the industry, that fortunately India doesn't have that issue in terms of building and structure safety. That is very well taken care of. Good infrastructure, good, in terms of, just the workplace, things, that workers should need good lighting, air ventilation, those kind of things. But in terms of agreement or the legally binding agreement, we recently had, I don't know if it'll come up later in the discussion, but just early last year, we had this agreement. It's called Indigal Agreement. The agreement was between H&M, a local trade union, and the supplier. and it's on to address sexual or gender-based violence in the workplace. So that is an equivalent because it is legally binding. However, how is it? It is only effective or implemented in that in the group of factories in that region. But I think it's a great success because the unions are having a say, and also considering where India, just under 2% of the workers are unionized in the industry. Such an agreement is made with the local union and a global brand with the supplier. So it's a tripartite agreement. So I would say I would draw some parallels with Accord and the Dindigul agreement there.
Just a quick one on the back of what you just said, Suhasini. I don't know if there is a hard and fast answer, but you mentioned 2% of workers are unionized. And why is that? Why is it not higher than 2%? Is there a theory to that?
Well, so, yeah, no, it could be looked at. I mean, conventionally, there are, I mean, all these, we have 7 national trade unions. These were all from public sector, unions, very male leadership, that kind. And the garment industry, because it's predominantly women workers who have dual responsibility. One, I would say that the union leaders or unions in general, they did not know how to or when to get this approach these workers to become a union member. So one, because it wasn't a captive workforce, like for example, in railways or in postal department, you have this, I mean, all the staff in the postal department is by default a union member of that, union active in that department, which wasn't the case with the garment industry. And workers do not have time because soon after work, they're rushing back home, do their chores and attend family. So there's just no time where they could be, unions could approach. And the unions were not innovative in terms of coming up with new forms of unionization. So that was one lost side. The other one is, I would say, more the governance and the general shrinking space of civil society that we see not just in India, but also in the neighboring countries. And I would also, just extend it a bit also across. So there's been a lot of, workers are not allowed to unionize. They are perceived as a threat to the business. They are considered anti-business, which our government definitely do not want. They want more business, more investment, more employment. So the narrative around unionization is just the opposite, which definitely serves the business to some extent, I would say, and only in the short term. But in the long term, it doesn't, of course, it doesn't inculcate a healthy industrial relation in the industry. And then workers are left out of their whole awareness about rights and how they can approach or demand rights, assert their rights. So there's a very dark side to why workers are left out of unionization. The business is profiting, but it's not a good way of running a business, and it cannot go on like this in the long run. Yeah.
And so, Suhasini, you spoke about the Dindigul agreement and how the workers' voices were represented and they were part of the agreement and the decision-making process of it. And how often, and this question is to everyone, how often does that happen, and what are the steps being taken by organizations to include workers' voices, workers' decision-making in the decision-making process? So what are those steps? What does it look like, and how can we improve that? How can we make sure that they have a seat at the table?
I can go first. At least at U level, I think it's definitely something that's incredibly complex, because what we see is that a lot of NGOs do not actually have a lot of connections of stakeholders on the ground. So they will actively campaign for legislation at U level, even if they're working in the sector, but might not ultimately be able to platform the voices of government workers, the voices of impacted stakeholders across the industry. We do, of course, have organizations like IndustriALL, like Clean Clothes Campaign, who are able to bring and platform these voices. And I think at Fashion Revolution, we also try to be a bridge between the reality on the ground and then what policymakers are trying to legislate. But just to give you a concrete example, I attended an event or a panel discussion at the European Parliament to discuss legislation to ban forced labor. And again, there were some impacted stakeholders in the room, but I think what's really difficult is that we're sort of using their stories to a certain extent, sometimes as poverty porn, where we're asking them to, retell the extremely difficult stories so that politicians start caring. And I think that's sometimes quite problematic as well, because ultimately they're put in these boxes where, well, we have someone from, someone who used to be a child garment worker. Let's hear that story for 3 minutes and let's move on. And then you have NGOs who are coming together and trying to discuss legislation, but we have 3 minutes to make a point about all the legislation and all the points that need to be included, making sure that we cover every single voices and make sure that we also platform the right voices as well. So I think it's still very, very difficult, at least at EU level, to make sure that we not only platform the right voices, but also that we safeguard the voices of the people that have been impacted by, human rights abuses that are really horrible and absolutely traumatic. And then making sure that policymakers actually listen and take into account not only those testimonials, but also what the next steps are going to be. So I think it's definitely not a straightforward process. And I think that's something that we're still navigating. I'm sure other organizations have had this issue of trying to find the point where on one hand, you make sure that you have the attention of policymakers in the room and you make your point across, making sure you also have voices of people who have lived experience, but also making sure that it leads to concrete actions rather than yet another panel where we've discussed really difficult issues, where we make people relive extremely traumatic events, but ultimately don't lead to anything. So I think that's where we are. We're trying to still navigate this at Fashion Revolution.
Can I come in? Or Petra, you wanted to say something?
That's fine. You go ahead. You go first. I'll come in after.
I would say that there are a couple of, at different levels, one through the normative framework that the government and the international organizations are trying to bring in this workers' voice element, that they are at the center of any policy legislation. And to begin with, it's the OECD guidelines, which has come, the HRDD framework of the OECD guideline has, worker in the center, and the companies are expected to consult them, have them in all the decision-making process. And then we also see it in the legislations, like the EU, the CSDDD. There also it mentions, to follow the HRDD cycle. So at the international level, where brands are expected to have consultations and have worker in the center when in doing all their business and making a decision, purchasing practice, giving in their sourcing strategies. I think at the brand level, what should happen, the step that brands should take is, one, they should prioritize or prefer destinations where there are trade unions, active trade unions in the country. So the countries which allow trade unions, freedom of association. So that would be a big facilitator for it'll just automatically allow workers to be in the center. So there'll be unions, there'll be representative of these workers, trade unions, whom the businesses can consult. And then it's just very organic and the best way to consult workers and have workers' voice included in their action. The second is, so in the absence of trade unions, then the companies should look out for good multi-stakeholder structures. So where the workers, labor rights organizations, workers representation, even the small ones, but suppliers, brands or companies, preferably government offices. You can have all the stakeholders, but that could be one point of consultation for brands where they are really talking about how would workers, how can workers benefit from or be impacted from certain action of the brand. So that could be one point of consultation, which is also, which is, I think it's not mandatory, but it is mentioned in the HRDD framework as well. And actively look out for trade unions to consult. So this is the the onus is more on the companies, the brands, to seek trade unions and workers to include in their policies. And where the trade unions are not there, then the multi-stakeholder structures would be the place to go to have workers' voice included in their action before they decide on anything, on the purchasing practices. Thanks.
Yes, just quickly say, I mean, I agree with all of the above. And, you know, as we know, freedom of association is a fundamental right at work. So every worker has at least the fundamental right, well, provided the country signed the ILO convention. But, and sometimes, like I say, sometimes there are no unions, but a lot of the times there are unions. And for the employer, it is easier to negotiate with one counterpart as opposed to having several different negotiations. And when you have like real worker representation, I mean, ideally, especially where I come from, we wanted to be trade unions. I know that that's not always the case. So I agree with you as well that, you know, but someone who legitimately represents the workers. And I think that to a large extent, it's also a question of education and training and capacity building, that sometimes you don't even know that you have these rights. It's also, you know, generations of not knowing. So you don't know that you don't have to be subjected to some, you know, that you should earn, you know, a living wage, you should have breaks, you should have a safe working environment. It's not, you know, we take it for granted, you know, at least us here on the panel, because we know so much about it. And so I think another time where the extremely complex garment supply chain comes into play is because, again, when you look at these brands, if you look at Inditex headquartered in Spain or H&M headquartered in Sweden, where I'm from, I think Sweden has a unionization, like an organizing rate, like 70% of the Swedish workforce are members of trade unions. We have a history of industry-wide bargaining. So I think that, you know, the majority of the brands, they know how to engage with workers in their home country. And again, because of the extremely complex supply chain, that may get lost along the way. But the dynamic of you know, of good social dialogue works as well in India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh as it does in Sweden or Spain.
Thank you both for sharing that. I think we have a question in the chat from the incredible Rini Bankwal. Thank you so much for joining us. She's actually in Paris, but Indian. So thank you for the question. I'm going to jump into that question. Have any of you read it? So I'll just read it out. As we know, living wages continue to be calculated in a manner that still keeps the employee under the poverty line. Are there mechanisms in place in South Asia where the wages paid are fair and are inflation adjusted? Since wages barely change or are merely mapped against local inflation, workers rarely have upward mobility and stay generationally poor. Maybe you could take that, Abhishek, and then we see if anyone else on the panel would like to answer, unless someone's got itching to answer that question now. You happy to take it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can say that, you know, living wage as a concept in practice right now is really far from reality, right? I mean, we are still struggling across the board and getting the minimum wage going. And so that itself is the first step. That being said, you know, let's say at Fairtrade, we are looking at setting the living wage as a kind of a benchmark, which will hopefully in due course and time, bring certain components and levels of the industry, at least those who are minded towards sustainability, those who are minded towards, you know, fair practices, to actually start moving up that ladder. So we have adopted a living wage framework, which is called the Anchors framework, where there is a calculation which is based on a far more holistic set of living conditions beyond just the nutritional value, your housing, clothing, bare essentials, extringencies as they may arise, and then that is revised on an inflation basis periodically, not every year, but periodically. So there are frameworks which are there. These are right now more like you know, lighthouses, which are trying to show a direction of travel. The overall, I would say, space of and the level at which it is currently operating is very, very far from it, and it's more at a minimum wage conversation, where you're right.
Thanks, Abhishek. And if Suhasini, you're next, and then Delphine after.
Yeah, so FairWear has a very long body of work on living wage, and our work is only limited to the garment industry, so where the finished product is made. So that is again limited to first-tier suppliers, the exporters, if we can say, and we have also several brands paying up living wage. So that's a real example. Abhishek, we may get in touch separately as well. Where workers are getting paid a higher amount, I would not say much higher, but definitely higher than the minimum wage, with an idea that at one point brands will be able to pay the living wage. Now, what FairWear says, and it's also the message to the supplier, that the payment of living wage again has to come from the difference between the minimum wage and the living wage, and the living wage can be any target, any wage. So we are not looking at the living wage, so whatever the figure would be, but as long as there is an attempt to pay higher and progressively higher every year or every other year, alternate year, then eventually we will reach that stage. And then we have also built an app. We call it Fair Price app, and it's open. It's an open source. Anyone can look at the comparable of what the current wage is and what a target wage a brand wants to pay, or a union would want to have. So it's a very practical tool for any stakeholder to work on the wage. So what is the current wage, what they want to have, and then eventually what will be the difference in the product price. If we are that transparent, the supplier, the brand, the trade unions. So it will also show the difference in the retail price or the cost price of the per product costing. So it helps in decision making. So, okay, not 50%, but maybe we can try with 30% increment and then see, and we can still be competitive in the market. So it'll just help the businesses in deciding. In terms of mechanism, there's, I think we should not get bogged down by one, that what is the living wage figure, because then that is the perfect scenario. And if you want to get to that level, perfection is a bit idealistic, and you can keep talking and arguing and asking for more, and this is not included, and that concept is missing, and everything. I think because in this whole argument of having the best mechanism or the living wage figure, workers are losing out. They are losing out on the extra income that they would have gotten if brands were willing to pay up that much higher. So it's a matter of just starting and paying up more than what they are currently getting. The caveat is that if you allow the supplier, the exporter, and the brand to decide or to calculate the living wage in that area for workers, it is going to be around the minimum wage or even lower, because they have to argue that what they're paying is the living wage. But very surely the workers are not included in this whole process of deciding what a living wage would be. So to answer to Rini, I would say that if you want to get into the calculation of living wage, you have to include the trade unions, workers' body, to decide, what all should be included. And definitely a saving element, and the health and education, those aspects, what Anchor talks about in their methodology. And then it's about just starting to pay up more. It's the brand's responsibility to pay up more, and the supplier is definitely doing the minimum wage part, and that's their responsibility. But brands should not shy away from paying up more towards living wage.
Yeah, now just to build on what Suhasini said, I think our textile standards, which we've been taking to the market for I think the last 3 or 4 years now, where also we've got a living wage factor, the Anchor framework brought in. I think one of the learnings that we're finding, which is the challenge to kind of get the whole thing moving, and like Suhasini's referred to the FairWear framework, our framework also talks about incremental increase towards that, because it is significant. But it's also a challenge of coordination, right? So there is no manufacturer where 100% of their production is being done for one brand, and a brand that is willing to pay the living wage, shall we say, right? You will find typically percentages of the production going into a particular supply chain where a brand is willing, and we are also working with a handful of brands who are willing to pay a living wage. But the ultimate argument from the production side, which is all very legitimate, is to say, hey, when we pay a living wage, we have to pay to the whole factory. We cannot say only these 2 lines of production are going to be getting a living wage because this brand is willing to pay it. And the second thing is, once we start paying a higher wage, when that brand takes their business somewhere else, if they do, we are stuck and we will still have to pay that wage, because then, there is this whole issue where the workers' expectations are set. So, there is a huge challenge of coordination. There's a huge challenge of the market's willingness to pay collectively. And you do have great case studies, I'm sure, and I'd love to exchange more notes where maybe we have more synergies, Suhasini. But we do have great case studies across different parts of the supply chain where, people are willing to do it. But the question is of the coordination, where again, I feel legislation might have a role to play. And so, coming back to what Petra was saying, when it's legally binding, then it gets obviously a lot more real. And when it's on voluntary basis, then this problem of coordination also kind of tends to create a challenge, even when people are well-meaning.
And just very quickly to add to this, interesting resources that you can have a look at. So you've got the Industry We Want, which relies on data from Wage Indicator Organization. And what's particularly interesting about this data is that it doesn't look at a specific living wage methodology, but it's actually combined all of them. So you can see what would constitute the lowest living wage figure and the highest. So ultimately you can have a range as well. So that's one thing, definitely some useful resource to have a look at. You can also look at our map that we have on our goodclosefairpay.eu website, where you can look at different countries and look at what constitutes a minimum wage. But as Suhasini rightly said, I think there's 2 things that are particularly important. The first is brands ultimately paying more to their suppliers. And we've seen this even in my own experience visiting a factory which produced garments for only one brand, which is quite rare. And when I asked them, why don't you pay a living wage? You only work with a single brand. You know exactly how much your garment workers are being paid. Again, this is where legislation comes in. They're not forced to. And that's why they're not paying more. All they said is, please ask that question to headquarters. But ultimately, there is no legally binding agreement that would force them to pay more. The second example about the importance of involving garment workers is you do have collectives, even around India, where what they'll do is they'll discuss with their workers, okay, this dress, how long is it going to take you to make it? And obviously they have like a cost per hour. So if it takes 5 hours to make that dress, they know how much to ask for the brand in order to make it at a living wage rate. So I think it's really important to involve garment workers in that conversation as well.
And can I just quickly just to say that it is also really important to distinguish, a minimum wage is set by the government, or it could be a regional government depending on the country structure, but that's set by the country. So, and then of course the brands can always, or the employer can always pay more. Of course, we have, I think most employers in France pay more than the minimum wage, for example, again, bringing it back to Europe. So, but in some countries, there is also a need, of course, if you have a decent minimum wage, then of course, you can adapt the space for the garment owner, for the factory owner, for example, to pay up to a living wage, then that would probably be significantly less. So the textile unions in Bangladesh are currently negotiating for an increased minimum wage, because theirs is currently actually voted at 70. I should know, but it hasn't been increased since 2018. So their minimum wage is nowhere near to live off this, as everywhere else, increasing inflation in the country. But so I think it's important to, because some brands or some manufacturers, some employers will also hide behind the fact that, but we pay the minimum wage. But, if that's not enough to live on, then there's a whole other conversation to be had. So minimum wage and living wage are unfortunately not the same thing.
And if I'm allowed to add, and time allows, it's also the responsibility of the brands to, Abhishek, you pointed out very well the complexity of this whole, the industry, and therefore they have a lot of reasons on why they can't be paying living wage. but it's a matter of sitting together and then finding how we can pay living wage. So that they are not investing their time and resource on. And in the whole gamut of, how and why, and therefore we can't pay, we should understand that who is on the losing ground and who is making all the money that because of cheap labor, because of absence of law, or because of lack of implementation of the law, who is holding resources. So there's larger responsibility on the other side of the supply chain than how suppliers. I sometimes feel quite sympathetic towards the supplier, because they're caught in between. They have to negotiate for a best price with the brand, and then they have to pay minimum wage, and once the wages increase, they cannot go back because wages can't be brought back. So brands have to then therefore have a long-term relationship with the suppliers, give some kind of foresight that, okay, we'll be there for 5 years or 10 years or even longer, some predictability, so that the suppliers are in good or sure-footed when they embark on this journey together with the brand. So it can't be a lone journey of a supplier. The brand and the supplier has to work together towards getting the living wage paid to the workers.
Completely agree. And brands with other brands also kind of coordinating.
Indeed. Yeah, totally.
That.
Yeah.
Something that needs to happen. Agreed.
So there's a pile of questions that we have to get through, but on that point, I just wanted to say, I think Delphine, through Good Clothes Fair Pay, there was this statistic shared recently about what a CEO gets in a day versus a person working in the garment factory. If you have that stat to hand, perhaps you could share it. But I know it's on goodclothesfairpay.org, I believe.
So we calculated that within, we counted down to 10 seconds, and in only 10 seconds, as a fashion executive will make what a garment worker in Bangladesh makes in a day. And I think it's just to illustrate the gap that we're seeing within the fashion industry. And just to bring it back to our Good Clothes Fair Pay campaign, we talked about the need for legislation. So at Fashion Revolution, as part of a global coalition, including Fairtrade International, including FairWear and IndustriALL as well, we decided to put together a legal proposal demanding a living wage due diligence legislation at EU level, because the EU is the largest importer of textile, therefore has a huge responsibility and huge impact regarding fashion supply chains globally. So what we've done is we've submitted a European Citizens Initiative, which is a process by which, if you submit a legal proposal to the European Commission and they sort of approve it and they say that they can create legislation on that topic, you then have 12 months to collect 1 million signatures from anyone with an EU passport. Whether you live in India, whether you live in Brazil, you can definitely sign our initiative. And if we do get the 1 million signatures that we need by July 2023, we will then be able to discuss directly that legislation at EU level with EU policymakers. We already have a lot of members of the European Parliament that are very supportive of our proposal. But again, this means that any company who sells their product on the EU market, whether their supply chain is based in Bangladesh, in India, in Brazil, would have to comply and really make sure that they close the gap between what garment workers are currently earning, which, as we know, is not enough, and what constitutes a living wage. So again, this is really why this campaign is absolutely crucial for us, and why we need to make sure that we legislate the fashion industry.
Thank you, Delphine. I have a quick question on when I speak to smaller brands. I work a lot with smaller brands who are working on sustainability, and they tell us that, whenever they're talking to consumers about that, raw materials prices has increased, the consumer nods and says, okay, I understand why the overall price of the garment increases. But the same kind of understand is not accorded to when we say we have to raise or we have to pay our garment workers better. Does that apply? Have you ever noticed that the same kind of like material versus people, that understanding of rising prices or it impacting the overall price of the final product, does that apply to bigger supply chains, the whole industry at large? And if so, why does it happen? Why do we value materials more than we value the lives of people?
I
I will quickly say that I think it does happen. And I think it's, again, the supply chain is so long and complex, and the workers are at the bottom of it, they're at the far end. And so it's, it's easier to squeeze the bottom, just as if money coming into the supply chain is increasing, it very rarely trickles all the way down to the workers. And one obvious way to counter that is, of course, for the workers to get organized and to realize that they have rights, they have a voice, and there is a counterpart with whom they could negotiate. And so I do think that's I'll let someone else speak.
Just to take it quickly back to Rana Plaza and why the only workers that were in the building that day were gone workers. Ultimately, I think we have to think about why would anyone accept terrible working conditions? And I think the reason why is because of poverty wages, because there is a sense of you do not have any other solution than to go to work, even though you know that the building itself, and they knew that, was not safe. And that's why, despite the fact that all the other workers that were usually working in the building were allowed not to go into that building anymore, government workers did not have that choice. They were told that if they do not go into work, they will not receive their salaries. And again, that's where we can see and we can find so many cases of modern slavery within the fashion industry, is because of the lack of collective bargaining, because of the lack of trade unionization. And I think what we see as well, and I think one of the main issues that we're currently seeing when we talk about forced labor legislation, is the fact that we're looking at how to ban products that were made using forced labor. We're not thinking about addressing the root cause. I think that's a huge issue when we might value materials more. There's so many initiatives and there's so many discussion around the materials that are going to be sustainable, the materials that are going to be the future of the fashion industry. But what about the people who already make these clothes? And what about addressing the root cause of forced labor? You can't just stop buying products. What about the people who already make these products? What about their living conditions? What about their livelihoods? And I think that's something that we're really pushing for. And I know other organizations on this call are already pushing for when we think about banning forced labor and why people find themselves in situations of forced labor. In some places, obviously, it's because of the political landscape, as we've seen in the Uyghur region in China. But also, we find so many people that simply do not find that they have a choice. They have to go into work. They feel like they have to accept these working conditions. Otherwise, they won't be able to provide for themselves and their families.
And I'm just going to jump in quickly again, but just off the back of what you said about forced labor and about not having a choice. So this does not apply to Bangladesh or India, but one of the campaigns that we are running as IndustriALL is for government companies or brands to divest from Myanmar, because it is simply not possible to do due diligence in a country which is run by a military dictatorship. And then there are arguments of saying, no, but we should stay because we give people, people, at least they have a job, they get to earn money. But basically that we see a lot of forced labor, we see a lot of child labor. The wages have gone down. I think it's down to $1.60 or something per day. And so it's simply not possible. And it is a very, clear example of forced labor.
Yeah, I would only be repeating myself by saying that if it is just because of lack of unionization or freedom of association that the companies, and be it at the supplier level or at the brand level, where they find it okay to suppress the workers because they are one worker at a time, and then they can threat them, they can exercise their power. But if they are in a collective form, if they say we are not going to the workplace because the cracks are developing and it's a threat to our life, I don't think as a collective body, any employer could have asked them to, forcefully go, and otherwise you'll be fired. Because you see the strength in numbers, which is what, I think it's a very fundamentally, we have to address at that level. If workers are not organized, then everyone is up there to suppress them.
Thank you. So look, just listening to you all, I think right now we have access to so much information. We're in the digital age as well. We're at the click of a button. We can get access to information. Just while some of you were talking about some of the initiatives, I was having a little dig around at the same time. We have lots of information. People have access to information. We want a more conscious consumer. We want greater governance. We want more responsible manufacturers. At the same time, maybe some of you could just shed some light on why transparency actually matters. Why does transparency matter? And how can we encourage greater transparency and accountability in the garment industry supply chains? FairWear, Fashion Revolution, Fairtrade, IndustriALL, you're all doing incredible work. And there's many more organizations around the world that talk about transparency. Why does it matter?
Can I? Yeah, okay, Delphine.
I mean, obviously, transparency is one of our main focus in our work, given that we, as I mentioned before, launch on an annual basis our report called the Fashion Transparency Index. And ultimately, I think we have a very quick sentence as to why transparency matters. What you can't see, you can't fix, ultimately. I think that's very much the bottom line is we know that most of the brands do not know how, where, and their products are made. And so the reason why the Transparency Index was created is so that we would push and pressure brands to provide their suppliers list and understand in what conditions these clothes were made and where. Simply because when a violation happens within those factories, it was impossible to trace it back to a specific brand. So that was the starting point of the Transparency Index. And then we now have 5 sections looking at all the policies covering both environmental and human rights aspects, looking at the governance and accountability at governance level, what is the responsibility of executives in terms of achieving sustainability targets across the company. How do we make sure that suppliers are incentivized to improve their working conditions? Our traceability section looks at traceability and transparency across suppliers lists, so making sure that these suppliers lists are in the public domain. Our section 4 specifically looks at due diligence and then looking at all the environmental strategy and due diligence that they have in place as well. But again, the role of transparency is very much that you absolutely cannot at the moment regulate the fashion industry if you do not have a level of visibility. We often hear stats around the fashion industry being a major contributor to the climate crisis. But when you know that at factory level, how many factories in the fashion industry are actually tracking environmental data? I come from an environmental auditing background where I used to go into factories, and at every single factory, there used to be an EHS manager, environmental health and safety manager, that would collect on a daily basis environmental data. You would know exactly the water consumption, energy consumption, waste production, and so on at every single factory. And all this data would be collated. Within the fashion industry, that's just not something that's a standard practice. So again, when we talk about the environmental impact of the fashion industry, we simply don't have the visibility that we need to actually reduce the environmental impact of the fashion industry, which is why at Fashion Revolution, we're really pushing for the indicators that are included within our Transparency Index to be included within the upcoming legislation on on reporting, basically, which is going to be linked to the due diligence legislation. So we're really pushing for more transparency and better tracking on environmental data. And I think we can say the same thing about human rights impacts. Again, something like the Rana Plaza collapse would not, I think it would be handled, I'm hoping, very differently if we had better visibility. We would also have better accountability. We would be able to hold these brands accountable regarding their human rights impacts across the fashion supply chain. And I think a very key case to illustrate this is a few years ago, there was a Dalit garment worker that was unfortunately murdered and raped by her manager at factory level. There was only one brand that made the headlines. I'm not going to name the brand, but the brand was the only brand where we could see that they were clearly linked to that factory, even though lots of other brands were also producing in that same factory. And the reason why is because that brand publishes their supplies list in the public domain. I think that's a clear example where we can hold a brand accountable when something happens at factory level.
Yeah.
The same example that you gave, Delphine, does it also deter other brands saying if, if we were also that transparent, our names would be splashed across global media?
So we had that conversation a few years ago. Some brands said we will never publish our suppliers list in the public domain. That's absolutely never going to happen, especially in the luxury sector. We now have multiple brands in the luxury sector that are publishing their suppliers list. Namely, for instance, like Gucci has published their suppliers list I think it was last year for the first time. Again, we're seeing a shift and we're seeing better collaboration because they also know that with the creation of tools like the Open Supply Hub, where now you can actually look at a specific factory and see which brands are producing. And I think brands are now understanding the purpose of collaboration rather than hiding behind, we don't want to disclose who our suppliers are because they might, it might be anti-competitive and another brand might actually try and poach them. I think we're really seeing a shift and better collaboration. So we went from having a low percentage of brands publishing their suppliers list. I think in 2017, it was only 32% of brands out of 100 publishing their tier 1 suppliers list. And now out of 250, we have 48% of brands publishing their tier 1 suppliers list in the public domain. So although this is still a narrative that exists, I think we still have really shifted the conversation and the role of tools like Open Supply Hub to make sure that there is better collaboration at factory level.
I think a key point to probably to add here is just because an organization is transparent, it does not mean that they are sustainable. And I think that's something that's really important to land, that transparency does not mean sustainability, but it's a step on the path to being more sustainable. And on that note, I think, Shruti, I think we've got a bit of an innovation question, I believe. Is that right? Or tech?
Yes, I think there is a lot of conversation about tools that help you with transparency, with traceability, sharing more information with consumers, sharing more information across supply chains. Do you see, and I see a lot of that conversation in the environmental context of fashion, but do you see the same role of technology in promoting sustainable and ethical practices in the garment industry for improving working conditions of garment workers? And if so, what are those methods, or if there are none, what is your hope for technology's intervention in this space?
Yeah, I'll kick off by just saying there is a lot of technology which is right now being developed around this whole measurement and traceability framework, I would say. And that is right now, you're very, very right, focused on the environmental side. We're talking about the use of blockchain. We're talking about, use of technology for doing life cycle analysis or things like a carbon footprint in a supply chain. We're seeing things like DNA testing for material provenance and so on and so forth, right? So you're absolutely right that the lead point is right now on the environment. But in due course, I think the framework as it develops, and the cost is very high, just to be very clear. This is literally like, when the solar energy conversations were happening about a decade and a half ago, and the cost of solar energy was 2 or 3x what the conventional energy or coal energy was coming from, right? So it was in an exploratory stage to where it is today, cheaper to actually buy solar energy than it is to buy coal energy. So it's going to take some time. It's going to need that evolution to take place. Of course, technology is accelerating. And as it does that, I think there would be opportunities then to use this traceability framework to bring in some of those coordination challenges and providing, therefore, that assurance in a framework for better practices. I think it's going to take some time. It's still going to need technology also in the context of grievance redressal. I think, again, those things are right now at a very, very early stage that people are exploring how anonymity through technology can facilitate grievance redressal to enable workers, even when they're not unionized, to have a voice in extreme scenarios. But these are all at an early stage on the social side, and on the environmental side, it's kind of right now getting adopted at some scale.
Yes, and let me just add to that on a much smaller scale. So not sort of big technological systems, but there is an app, for example, that's been developed together with Anti-Slavery International and ASOS for migrant workers in Mauritius. So that's also one way of using technology. It's an app. They can find out, they can download it and they can find out about, their rights and any questions that they may have. So that's something which is, it's a small scale technology, but things like that, which can then be scaled and multiplied to other countries. And again, it's a cooperation between Anti-Slavery International and ASOS, for them sort of taking responsibility for the workers in the supply chain.
I think
Indeed.
I just found that. Is that Just Good? So I'm just looking at the app now. The Just Good Work Mauritius app. That's the one. So I'm going to pop it into the chat for anyone that might.
Yeah, there are other apps that are, built to, I think, for example, to register migrant workers, and irrespective of the industry, but to register migrant workers and what they're entitled to tap grievances, of course, or to do other, in fact, sourcing data, sourcing as in worker information in one platform. And I think it's great to be at speed with the technology, and eventually I think like the environmental data that is being captured, it will eventually also start capturing social standards, and also which factory, what is the compliance level, how many complaints did this factory got, and how was it addressed. Those things will come just with a scan of a barcode or something like that, which is a great thing, and we should keep up to speed with the advancement of the technology. The flip side is we should also be aware that it's not misused. And I'll give you an example of how, this is a real example of how there was a worker survey done through phone, like very basic 10 questions, yes, no. And one of the question was about, are you a part of a union? And yes, no, which union? ABC, whatever. And all the data that was collated, these workers who said yes, they were all fired at one point for no reason at all. So it is also, you also see the way the data can be used. So if it is also, one has to be very conscious of how and why, in what way the data will be used. Yeah, so the technology has to be responsible when they are harnessing data especially from workers. And this, because it looked like a very benign survey of workers and where do you live and what age, those kind of things. And one of the questions actually became a reason why they were fired. So because this is a case from India, and clearly they did not want to have a union or any unionization attempt even. So they thwarted it right as soon as they got to know. So it has to be responsibly done, the use of technology, especially when it comes to social standards.
Thank you, Suhasini. So look, this panel discussion is beyond Rana Plaza, and we're discussing how we are building a sustainable future for garment workers in India and around the world. And I just want to bring you back a second to your respective organisations before we do some conclusions and a roundup. And if I could ask you all, if you could just in a snapshot tell us what your mission and purpose is at your organisation, and if we could kick off with maybe, is there a volunteer to kick this one off, or otherwise I'll do a random selection.
Right.
I'll cue Petra then in that case.
Well, we're a global trade union federation, which doesn't mean very much to many people, but basically it's a global organization to which trade unions can affiliate. So as an individual can't become a member, but a trade union in a country can choose to become a member of a global trade union federation, and there are numbers of them. And what we do is, of course, we collectively have the voice of 50 million workers with us, so, and we have in many cases access to, or facilitated access to international companies and to governments. And so we are, like we say ourselves, we're a force of global solidarity, and we represent the workers on the ground. And we work to, change working conditions to, promote and protect workers' rights all along the supply chains in a number of different sectors, mainly in manufacturing. Yes. Do you want anything else to that?
No, that was great. Thank you, Petra. Over to Abhishek, Fairtrade India.
Yeah, so Fairtrade is a multi-stakeholder organization where 50% of our decision making is with smallholder farmers and workers, and 50% with the national fair trade organizations, which are more civil society organizations. Our mission is to build a world where producers, which is smallholder farmers as well as workers, primarily in the agricultural-based value chains, where they can get a better livelihood and are in a better position to determine their future. So we work through a combination of mechanisms of fair trade standards for production across value chains, setting fair trade minimum prices so that they have workers and farmers have access to a secure income level once the price volatility in the agricultural commodity markets kind of kick in. And we also facilitate access to finance and access to markets so that we are building a sustainable ecosystem with brands. And then the final piece is, of course, working with consumers, raising awareness, harnessing them as campaigners and change makers to bring about change with businesses and with governments.
Thank you. And Suhasini, FairWear.
Yeah. Yeah, so we are a multi-stakeholder as well, and our focus is to improve the labor conditions, and now we talk about human rights conditions in the garment supply chain. And the way we see, us working is that we acknowledge that we cannot change the industry all alone. So we are all out for collaboration, working jointly together, either through MOUs or have partnership agreements or just a network. So we have to work together with all the other stakeholders active in the industry, and it can be business associations together or brands. There's all the associations there or the unions. So collaboration is one way to change the industry, because the way it is now is not the way to go ahead. The second is our effort is towards getting progressive legislations in place, and that is at EU level or at the European country, like that is the market country level, or also in the countries where production happens, be it omnibus law in Indonesia or the labor reforms in Bangladesh and India. So we are keeping a close eye and looking for giving recommendations on how it can be made better. So having progressive legislations. And the third is because just talking will not help, we also show that change can happen by some real examples. So we do act thanks to our member brands. Some are very enterprising and embark with us like right from the word go. So showing that either it is living wage or social dialogue or creating a platform in the country. So we are trying to show that things can happen, and this is the way that you can act, you as in the brands and the companies and whoever. So we are all about showing the solution and not just harping on the same problem year on year. So trying to encourage that change, we can do it together. So
I think collaboration is just so key. It's so I think we all firmly believe that we are stronger together. And I know that at the core of Fashion Revolution, it's all about collaboration. We are collaborators, essentially. Which brings me to Delphine. If you could sum up our mission, and then he's got a couple of other questions.
Of course. So we started off as a grassroots global movement after the Rana Plaza collapse, and we are now present in numerous countries, including we've now built a global network, including with our Fashion Revolution India team, and we're actively campaigning for a clean, safe, fair, transparent, and accountable fashion industry. that conserves and restores the environment and values people over growth and profit. So ultimately, we work on 3 pillars. The first one is industry change. So we do that by actively campaigning and collaborating with brands through our Fashion Transparency Index and having conversations using our questionnaire to discuss how they can improve their practices internally. And we are in a very privileged position as we work within and outside the industry, where we are able to have a direct contact with those fashion brands across the world, as we do not target specific brands, but we talk about systemic change when we talk about the fashion industry. The second is cultural change, and this is why we are such a powerful network, as well as we have such a huge presence on social media with our global network as well, where we actively try and inform consumers that they're not just consumers, they're also citizens, that they have a voice and they can learn about the issues that the fashion industry is currently facing from a human rights and environmental perspective, but also what they can do to act on them. So whenever we talk about the issues of the fashion industry, we often have a clear call to action. And this is why we're such a powerful network. Obviously, we work across very different cultural contexts, where in some countries we might be able to say you can email your member of the European Parliament, whereas in other countries you obviously know that there are limitations. So again, I think we're really powerful because we work across different cultures and we can inform each other and support each other in our campaigning efforts, and really try and raise the bar and highlight all the human rights and environmental issues that are happening, but also collaborate together to bring these issues at the forefront. And then the last way we work is on policy change. So through our advocacy work across the world, we've campaigned on numerous legislation in the US, legislation. At the moment, obviously, the EU is one of the bodies that has most of the legislations linked to the fashion industry in the pipeline. So again, we're very present, but again, we really try and leverage our network to make sure that we can really platform voices from across the world to demand the legislation that we want to see for the fashion industry.
Thank you, Delphine. I think we're almost at the close of the session. We want to ask each one of you to share one thing that you would like to change, one change you would like to see in the industry with respect to garment workers. And it could be a vision that you have or something that very, very specific that you think needs to change.
Shruti, just before they answer, we also ask you that question. So you will come round to you as well.
Do you want me to start? Okay, then. I think at Fashion Revolution, we always ask, who made my clothes? And I think it needs to continue. We want consumers to be more aware, and we want brands to, perhaps my dream is to see like a price breakup on every label, saying this is how much the worker was paid, this is how much the material cost. So that kind of transparency, how we have in food supply chains, to have that same kind of labels and ingredients that go into the clothes that are made for us.
This is a dive-in moment. So.
I can go next. Obviously, as the co-leader of the Good Clothes Fair Pay campaign, it'd be remiss if I didn't hope for living wages for garment workers worldwide. I think when we think of the fashion industry, so many issues intersect. Issues of overproduction are linked to issues of living wages. I think we can't see things in silos as being completely separate from an environmental and human rights perspective. So again, I think living wage is genuinely at the forefront of the issues that we should be fighting for in the fashion industry.
And then I'll dive in to say, very obviously linked to that, to see freedom of association applicable everywhere for workers to freely be able to join a union of their choice, and to, collectively gather their voices together to be, an effective counterpart to the employer. It's not a question of, as someone also mentioned, that the narrative is sometimes that unions just cause trouble, they're just here to ask for more than that they deserve. And like one of our trade union leaders in Morocco in the garment industry said this week, as we were in Brussels meeting with the Parliament and the Commission, said that we the workers, we help build the brands and make them profit, so we deserve fair treatment. And I think it's as simple as that. So, a solidified respect for workers' rights.
If I can go next, because it is almost, goes hand in hand with what Petra said. I would say that if brands start prioritizing or preferring sourcing countries and factories where unions are present, that will make a big difference in the rights, the work atmosphere, the rights, the payment, everything, because having a union is freedom of association is an enabling right, and if they are active and they're recognized, then all other rights will be more or less taken care of. So the brands should also change their sourcing strategy to where are the unions, and I would prefer a unionized workplace over a non-unionized one. So if that happens, it will be kind of perfect. Perfect.
Yeah, so I think all the points that I did want to make have kind of been ticked off, but I think one point which is also becoming relevant in the context of workers, certainly in the context of farmers, is looking at climate justice, right? So what we're seeing is those who've contributed least to climate change are facing the brunt of it, whether it's on the factory floor, which is increasingly becoming a hard place to work, and certainly in the context of farmers, it's also a livelihood question where whether it's a cotton farmer who is not able to produce because they are in a rain-fed area. So bringing in the livelihood conversation more firm and center into any conversation of sustainability, and a recognition that if you want environmental sustainability and social sustainability, economic sustainability for those who are most vulnerable is crucial. And only then we can achieve these other aspects of sustainability. I think if we can bring that would be amazing.
Thank you all so much. Appreciate sharing those visions and those missions. And I wish we live in a day where better business means better business. And I think decluttering all that noise from the greenwash to the realities, that's what I want to see. I want to see access to information, which is real information that allows us to make informed decisions. But, I really want to see change from those brands. All those leaders of the leading brands in the world raking in trillions, millions, billions. I want to see them step up. I want to see them step up and be on the ground and face the realities and make change happen and really mean better business. And that, I think, is something that we all want. So on that note, Shruti, concluding points and thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for taking out time today to speak to us about this important topic. And this would be really, really valuable to all the people who will listen to it going forward. So thank you for setting the context of Beyond Rana Plaza and the hopes, the dreams, the realities of today. Yes, that's it from my side. We can close the session.
Thank you.